Hello, I'm Robert Ellis, and this is the first of two talks about depolarising politics for the Middle Way Society. This first talk is called Political Values, Their Polarisation and Integration. So I'm going to be talking about what political values are, how our political values can be applied helpfully, why they end up in conflict, and what can we do about it. So we're very much in a position, particularly in the UK and US at the moment, where political conflict appears to be intractable. We need to think about the causes of that and what we personally can do to avoid making that situation worse, even if we can't resolve it. So my starting point here is the middle way. And the middle way is basically a principle of judgment, as I understand it. A principle that it's experiential values that are justifiable and responsible. But it's absolutes, whether positive or negative, that are not. So the middle way is the way at each point between absolutes on either side, whether positive or negative. The middle way puts us in the sphere, in the area of experience, where we can make experiential judgments. Now, political values in the middle way need to be seen, I think, in terms of ethics. So ethics is the broad area of how we make personal judgments. So we could make personal judgments based on a variety of different sorts of values. We could be thinking about the consequences of our actions. We could be following certain principles. We could be trying to be a certain sort of person. Those are quite common kinds of ethical values that people appeal to. Those can be ethically challenging and help us to judge better if they challenge our existing values in some way. But with the middle way, we always have to start where we are with the values that we actually hold at the moment, not just some ultimate idea of where we want to be. There's a principle of stretch involved. When we know what values we start with and we are challenged by possible alternatives, we can start to stretch those values, whether they're just individual ethical values or whether you see them as political values. On the other hand, though, if our ideas or our principles are absolutized, then they stop us from learning from experience. So they prevent us from stretching our values, and they prevent us from addressing the conditions around us. I'll be saying a bit more later about absolutization and what it means. But before we do that, I want to say a bit more about political values and what they are. So we're starting from our position in the middle, in our experience, based on our lives as they've been so far, whatever things have influenced us. So it could be our genes or our environment. Doesn't really matter why we are where we are at the moment. What we need to be thinking about is, what are our values at the moment? What do we do with those values? Obviously, in political terms, we're likely to have been influenced by various interests, so we don't live in a vacuum. We're all members of a certain class, probably, which we can at least vaguely be associated with. We probably have professional interests, we have family interests, we have regional interests. We have interests if we're people. And we're not going to be indifferent to those interests. That's what it's like to be human. We're also going to be influenced by ideologies which probably align with those interests. So we might think of ourselves as socialists or liberals or conservatives or whatever. If we have a certain kind of alignment which we feel to be our political values, that's a starting point. The important thing is to think about or reflect on what that means for us. What are those values and how are we going to interpret those values? Now, in thinking about what political values are, I find the analysis of Jonathan Haidt extremely useful. So this is found in the second part of his book called The Righteous Mind, which I can highly recommend at least the first and second parts of that book, though I'm not nearly so impressed by the third part. But the second part is where he talks about this analysis of political values. So what Haidt does, he's a social psychologist by training. He has gone into empirical research to try to identify what kinds of values, what political values people have across cultures in different sorts of circumstances. So what is it about humans in their groups and in their societies that leads them into certain sorts of values that they then apply in the decision making in their societies? And he came up, after a process of research and consideration, with 6 political values which he found underlie the different positions and the different ideologies that we adopt in relation to political issues. Now, where I disagree with Haidt is in his assumption that this is the whole of ethics. I don't think this is all that ethics is about, but it's an extremely good analysis of political or socio-political values, so the kinds of values that we apply in the political setting. So here are the 6. Justice, or fairness, is the first. So that's the positive value. The negative converse of it could be described as cheating. So justice or fairness is quite a basic value to us when we're children, particularly with brothers and sisters. We're likely to have a sense of fairness or quickly develop a sense of fairness. We want our share of the cake. It's not fair if somebody else gets too much of it. The second value is care or harm. Obviously that's very basic to us, particularly as concerned the care of children. But in society generally, we have a sense, or most of us have a sense of empathy. We think it's important to care for others, particularly those who are more weak or vulnerable. The flip side of that, which we're trying to avoid if we hold that value, is harm. So the sense that it's wrong to harm others or to be harmed is an aspect of that value. The third value, political value that Haidt identified, is loyalty. So the sense that we have that it's important to maintain our ties with others, maybe our ties within a certain group, maybe our individual ties. So we all have this sense. Whether we apply it consciously to politics is another matter, but if we have friends, if we have family, we're very likely to, in practice, feel that loyalty towards them is important, and that it's more important to look after them than to look after somebody else who may be a stranger. The flip side of loyalty is betrayal. So the idea that it's a bad thing to betray a person who we have ties of loyalty to. The next value in the list is authority. So again, this arises in our experience. The sense we have that some people's ideas and some people's advice or instructions are better than others. They're more likely to be based on helpful experience, help us address the conditions around us. Obviously that gets internalized as the voice of our parents, and there can be all kinds of complexes mixed in with it, whereby we start to obey authority automatically and uncritically. But authority can be a value for us even if we do have a critical view of the authorities we accept. You know, if you think it's a good thing that we have police, for example, then we respect authority in some respects, even if we think an individual policeman has behaved wrongly. The opposite of that is subversion, where somebody goes against authority and we assume that to be a bad thing. The fifth political value is sanctity, or you could call it purity. So the sense of certain things being sacred, that certain things shouldn't be interfered with, so they should be left to themselves, and that they are associated with special symbolic status. Obviously that applies to religious symbols and religious objects, if you think about how Muslims feel about the Quran, for example. But it can also be attached, for example, to natural landscapes that we feel strongly should not be polluted or destroyed. The opposite of that is degradation, and degradation is very much associated with disgust. So again, this is quite important for our survival, in the sense that we have a sense of disgust about polluted water, for example, or about our food being mixed in with excreta or something like this. Yeah, so that goes entirely against a sense of sanctity, which is in our interests as social beings. The sixth one, which Haidt identified later than the other five, is liberty. So liberty is the value that is important to allow people to do what they want, at least within certain limits, depending on how far you extend your value of liberty. It's really about not letting the alpha males get away with everything, not letting those who are powerful run everything. The opposite of that is oppression. Obviously, where some people who are powerful stop others doing what they would like to do. So those are the six political values, and as I've been trying to emphasise as we went through them, these are all part of everybody's everyday experience, and that's, I think, what is so powerful about them. It's not starting with political values from the kind of top end or the abstract end. It's not starting from this is socialism, this is conservatism, or whatever. It's breaking it down much further than that and thinking, what are the components of socialism or conservatism or whatever for an individual in their psychology. So just to recap on those six: justice, care, loyalty, authority, sanctity, and liberty. Now, you could analyse any of those political values in ethical terms. You could have principles based on them. For example, the principle of not doing harm, or of always obeying God, God as an authority. You could turn them into consequences that we believe to be valuable, so we could focus on making sure we did things which didn't bring about harm. So that's one of the quite common utilitarian ways of thinking about how to act. Or we could think of them as virtues, that we should try to be just, for example, or that we should be loving. That these are things that should be part of our characters. So we should try to develop ourselves so that we're spontaneously like that, so that we exhibit these values spontaneously all the time. But regardless of whether those values are part of our ethics, which they probably are, when it comes to political ideologies, when people get together and to some extent agree about the sort of pattern of political values that they have together, then we tend to end up with the familiar ideologies. So particularly socialism, conservatism, liberalism. For American watchers or listeners, what is often described as socialism will be liberalism. So there's a difference in the sense of liberalism on different sides of the Atlantic. Liberalism, for a British person, is a sort of middle of the way position quite often. But if you think of each of those three common ideologies in terms of Haidt's 6 values, then Haidt made it clear that there are ways in which they line up. So socialism, particularly, or what Americans may call liberalism, is likely to emphasise care and justice, and not to give a lot of attention to the other values. They particularly likely to be outraged, perhaps, at loyalty or authority being used as a basis of political decision making. Nationalism is an embarrassment if you're a proper liberal in that sense. But justice, being fair to the poor, particularly distributive justice, and care, looking after the weak, and obviously usually the idea that the state has some responsibility for that, tends to be part of the left perspective. Conservatism, on the other hand, according to Haidt, tends to have all of these values involved, so it has a wider spread of different political values typically. So there is a sense of care and justice, for example, for conservatives, but conservatives are much more likely to emphasise justice as just desert, as retributive justice, as stern father justice, if you like, rather than distributive justice, where there's a fair distribution of resources. So justice and care do matter to conservatives, but loyalty and authority and sanctity particularly do, in a way that people further left tend to find bewildering. And in a way that's not so hard to come to understand if you come from further left. If you think about the loyalty and authority and sanctity that you do feel strongly about, you just don't want to apply it to politics. So you could connect in that way with the human experience that will be behind the feelings of somebody who is more conservative. And then liberalism, in the British sense of being somewhere in the middle, well, liberals are more likely to emphasise justice and care and liberty, so to try and find some sort of balance between those three. So justice and liberty, there's a certain tension between them, because to make things just you have to organise them in a certain way so that people get a fair share, which tends to be in tension with the idea that people can do what they want and therefore build up property for themselves, for example. So that analysis of political values helps us to see our ideological preferences in a wider perspective. Now, I'm now going to go on to think about how those values could be used either in a provisional or an absolute way. So there are provisional uses of those values. That is, where we recognise, these values are important to us, but they might also need to be considered in relation to other values. They're not the whole story. That's a provisional use, but an absolute use of those values is where particularly you take one of those values, or perhaps several of them, but driving to the same sort of conclusion, and you assume that is the whole story. And therefore you rule out other values, you consider them to be invalid in some sense, not worth considering. They're part of the enemy, they're part of the rejected other, the shadow, or whatever you want to call it, beyond what you consider to be worthy. So, to understand that distinction more fully, we need to look at the features of absolutization and the features of more provisional uses of these sorts of values. So an absolutized use of any of these political values, well, it will tend to lack incrementality, which means it's not seen as a matter of degree. So there isn't a degree of fairness or a degree of care, for example, balanced against other things. If you're taking these values absolutely, then they're the only basis for judgment. And thus it's not a matter of how much. You tend to see it only in terms of either caring or not. Yeah. So supposing your policies lead to some person becoming homeless, you might ask, do you not care about this person? And that's an absolute. Either you care or you don't, rather than caring to some extent, rather than it being recognised that you can have a policy that is caring to an extent, but that actually leads for some people to be uncared for as a consequence of other things, of other values that have come in. So there's a lack of incrementality if you have an absolute belief. The only alternative to that value is its opposite, so it tends to be dualistic, and that's where polarisation obviously develops. So if you're not with us, you're against it, you're against us. So if you're not with me, you're with the terrorists, as George W. Bush said in a famous speech. So there's a false dichotomy or an unnecessary dualism in the absolutization of any political value. So when politicians become at their most ideological, the most rigid, they tend to think in this way. Absolute uses of political values also tend to involve rigid boundaries. So it then becomes rigid who is part of a group and who isn't, for example. So nationalism that excludes some groups and keeps in others tends to be absolute, which is why obviously the extreme right wing tends to be very absolute in their thinking. But you can also be rigid about other boundaries, like what is an acceptable level of public spending. No, we're going to stop here, we can't possibly spend more than this amount. That would also be a rigid boundary. There also tends to be an assumption of total authority from some source of information. So perhaps you appeal to some great political thinker or some economist, or perhaps you take a particular piece of evidence and you assume that tells you the whole story. But there may be other pieces of evidence. So even in the practical circumstances of an election, you believe one poll and you just discount all the others because the poll tells you what you want to believe. Absolutization also involves a lack of provisionality, which means that although there are some practical circumstances where we do need to draw lines, and we do need to, for example, prosecute criminals, or say that these people have broken the law and therefore will be punished in the justice system, and these will not. So that's the use of a line, but it has a practical justification, which you can justify in a balanced way using a combination of different values, recognising that those values need to work together. But with absolute values, That's not the case. And this absolutization tends to be constantly reinforced by a group. So very often people tend to think absolutely because everybody else does, and because they will continue to be accepted in that group. In fact, it's a shortcut to being accepted if they adopt all those absolute values. So absolute values are an easy option. They're easy to understand, relatively easy to understand, easy to identify with. You're then united in a group that holds those values against the other side, and you believe you've got the whole story, and that means any evidence or any other considerations you come across from the other side you will ignore or discount. That also means that absolute uses of those values are fragile. Because people can't gradually change those values in relation to other values, then when they go all at once. So you can get a sudden conversion, a political conversion rather like a religious conversion, where, like St. Paul, you suddenly give up your strongly held belief and you collapse and you go to the other extreme. Perhaps you join the other side. But usually that's only under duress, when you realise that the values you've been adopting are no longer serving you at all. But of course that won't help you very much. If you're just flipping to the other extreme of absolute, then you're not addressing conditions any better than you were before, probably. So that takes us to the other kind of uses of ideology, different kinds of uses of political values. That is provisional uses of political values. So we can use any of these ideologies. You could be a socialist or a conservative or a liberal, or probably, well, it's harder to be a provisional Nazi, I should think. Pretty difficult. But certainly with most complex political traditions, it's possible to adopt and use those traditions and interpret them in a provisional and helpful way. So if you do that, you do recognise that there are alternative options, and that you have chosen some options over others, and you have responsibility for doing that. That, supposing you do choose to put the emphasis on the interests of your nation, for example, you try to be, you're more patriotic, say, you recognise that actually, well, that other nations do have interests too, and there are other aspects of the issue. It's not just your nation right or wrong, even if you are interested in the interests of your nation. You do draw boundaries, perhaps, but you recognise those boundaries as contingent and pragmatic. So if you take the issue of who you let in the country, immigration policy, that's not based on rigid ideas of who should or shouldn't be in your country. It's based on a whole set of conditions which will, including what the public may accept and what will avoid causing riots. That's going to be part of your policy. It should be. You do have to build some boundaries in the realities of politics, but they don't have to be rigid ones, and it's actually a political virtue to be able to change them. Then you do have sources and you do have authorities, hopefully credible ones, probably experts rather than just gurus. So sources and authorities that are compared for their credibility, so you don't just take one source and assume that gives you the whole story. You do listen to alternative arguments and consider how they might be correct and what sorts of conditions they do address. it will be the values in those alternative points of view that you need to consider, not just the factual assumptions. Then those judgments also, the judgments you've made, will continue to be open to revision in the light of new evidence. By doing that, you'll also be showing your individuality, so you won't necessarily just go along with the group. You will be prepared to stick your neck out if necessary. If you have provisional use of these ideologies, that doesn't stop you standing in solidarity with others and working effectively in a group. Rather, provisional use of your ideology can make your group far more effective, because you'll be able to change direction when necessary. A provisional use of an ideology is also anti-fragile, to use the term coined by Nassim Nicholas Taleb. That means that it's not fragile, it develops rather than being destroyed through challenge. So if you've got a political position, somebody challenges it, and you realise, oh yeah, there's a weakness in what I believed here, which this person's pointing out, and you change your position is then stronger, it's better, it's taken more into account. So your position is actually strengthened through challenge and difficulty, up to a point. As long as it's not destroyed, it's likely to get stronger through challenge. So those are all ways in which you can identify a provisional use of an ideology or a political value. It's chosen from alternative options, the boundaries are contingent and pragmatic, different sources are compared, judgments are open to revision, you can make individual judgments, and you actually benefit from listening to the other side. You're anti-fragile. So, provisional use of political values is the basis on which conflicts between political values can be overcome. So to come to perhaps the crucial point of this talk, which is about polarisation and how we can overcome polarisation. Polarisation becomes intractable when we have one absolute position facing another absolute position. But we can integrate those positions by recognising when we're absolutising them and making them provisional. So absolutised values cannot be integrated. So absolutised values are dead set against everybody that doesn't fit into the whole story they've got. Provisional values, on the other hand, have not given up on having a position. They may be holding that position quite strongly and may need to, but nevertheless that position is adaptable. So values may be absolutised or integrated at both individual and group levels. The process is the same, but it's much more complex for groups. So I'm not going to say very much more about integration of groups in this talk, but hopefully I'll say more in the second talk in this series. I've talked mainly at the individual level here. So the first thing really is for the individual to look at their views and where they are absolutising their values, to recognise it and avoid it and make those values provisional. By doing that, they can avoid polarisation. Now, an illustration of that process is the two mules pictures, which is a set of pictures that was originally used by a pacifist organisation. So the two mules are an illustration of absolutised conflict. You've got these two mules who are set in their conflict, they're polarised, they're doing two things which are in conflict with each other. So each mule believes that their pile of hay is the one they've got to eat, and this enemy who's trying to stop them eating pile of hay is just wrong. Yes, so that's an absolutized conflict, but that absolutized conflict leads them to a point of frustration where they realise it's not serving them anymore. Now at this point they don't just flip. To flip would just be to switch places and pull against each other in the opposite direction. Flipping them won't help, but reframing will. So they sit down and they're forced to reconsider and reframe the way in which they're thinking about the situation. And in that new situation, they're no longer thinking in terms of absolutes. They don't reject the absolutes for their opposites. Instead, they become agnostic about them. So they no longer think absolutely, I've got to eat that bird of hay. Instead, they think about the possibility they didn't consider before, which is that of cooperating and working together to eat the piles of hay in sequence rather than together in different piles. Now, it's difficult to get people to recognise their absolutizations. That's a big challenge. But sometimes people just work it out by themselves. They reach a point of frustration where they have to think again. And this happens all the time, even though at the moment, polarisation may seem to be absolutely intractable. So when does reframing happen? This is perhaps the crucial point to end on. How does reframing happen? What's happening when those mules sit down and think again? Firstly, they become open to other options. So rather than the restricted options they've been thinking of before, they start to think of other options, and that enables them to choose what would best address the conditions. The conditions in this case are that they both want to eat. So what's the best way of allowing them to eat? The conditions in politics are obviously going to be much more complex than that. They might be, how do we address climate change, for example? How do we resolve conflicts between different countries? How do we organise trade, etc.? In the process of reframing, they reconsider various things. So they may consider the assumed facts. They may consider the values that they're using, which are inextricably interrelated with those assumed facts. And they may even reconsider the definition of the terms that they're using. So it's relatively easy to reconsider the facts. Once I point it out to you, actually this thing you believed about, for example, the cost of something like the cost of the EU for the UK, that's a factual issue. You could work it out on a spreadsheet. What you believe about the values of, however, may be harder to track down, but we can identify what our values are, and we can consider how those values might be stretched. So how can we identify a little bit more widely than we did to start with? So perhaps if we think about those two mules, the other mule might start to think, well, perhaps if I work together with this other guy, and what he does might matter as well, that he can get his pay as well. He doesn't have to suddenly become selfless. He just has to stretch his perspective a little bit. And that's not against his interests in any basic way. And then we may need to reconsider our very terms and their meanings. So stop going on about, who is a true socialist, for example, or true anything, because that's a good indicator of a rigid definition of the word that you're using. But terms are used for particular purposes. So you need to get back to the meaning and why you're using that term at all, what's good about it, and think pragmatically about that term rather than just identifying with a fixed definition of it. And finally, politics, as I mentioned earlier, does require agreement. So agreement as the basis of social action is just how politics works. You can't, in a democratic context, without a lot of oppression anyway, you can't make something happen without a basis of agreement about it, at least a majority supporting you. So given that need for agreement, you may need to reconsider your assumptions about what absolutely has to be done in order to make sure that something is done. And that's just how politics works. That's one of the conditions of politics. So that may also be part of the reframing. You may need to reframe out of an over-idealistic view of what needs to be done without in any way giving up on your understanding of the value of what needs to be done ultimately. So you can still have the wider perspective on which that value depends, at the same time recognise the need to compromise it in the short term. Now the middle way is not necessarily just about compromise. It's entirely contingent whether compromise is involved. But in some cases it obviously is. So reframing is the basis by which we integrate our political values. But reframing is not flip-flopping. And if somebody doesn't yield, they're not necessarily being dogmatic. Their resistance may be vital to address some conditions, so you need to listen to them. So I'd invite you really, on the basis of this, to reflect on what are your political values. Do you tend to absolutize them, or any of them, ever, at any point? How do you tend to do so? And if that's the case, how would you make your ideological commitments provisional so that they could be integrated, so you could overcome polarisation? What sort of reframing might you need to do that? Yep. So that's an entirely pragmatic way of thinking about your political values. And it's the kind of reflection we all need to have if we're to stand any chance at all of overcoming the kind of political polarisation we're experiencing at the moment.